I once met an American who confidently told me that Britain had no tanks at the start of World War II and mostly waited around for help. He said it pleasantly, like he was sharing a fun historical fact. The issue was simple. Britain invented tanks, built them, and used them decades before the United States entered the war. He didn't present this as an opinion. To him, it was settled truth. In his version of history, World War II truly began December 1941, peaked at D-Day, and ended because America arrived with courage, factories, and moral certainty. Everything before that felt like background noise. What made the moment striking wasn't rudeness. It was calm certainty. There was no argument, no hostility, no sarcasm. Just confidence reinforced by education, films, and repetition. Once I noticed it, I began seeing the same belief everywhere. While working near a historical site in Europe, an American tourist asked why British resistance was praised so heavily. He explained that America had saved Europe twice anyway, so focusing on earlier battles seemed unnecessary. He smiled as he said it, genuinely puzzled that anyone might disagree. I asked when he thought Britain entered the war. He paused, then guessed 1941. When I corrected him and explained that Britain declared war in 1939 and fought alone for over a year, his expression shifted. Not defensive. Just confused, as if reality didn't match a memory. He asked what Britain even did during that time. I mentioned the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, Atlantic convoys, and pilots being lost faster than they could be trained. He nodded politely, then said, "Yeah, but without America, none of that would have mattered anyway." That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. Entire years of sacrifice were compressed into irrelevance by a single conclusion. I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding of facts, but of scale, timing, and shared effort. Shaped by simple storytelling. When a country teaches history through arrival points instead of duration, contribution begins to feel like authorship. Joining late but decisively becomes more memorable than enduring early losses. Over time, helping turns into saving, and saving quietly becomes winning alone. This isn't unique to America, but America perfected it. Films, textbooks, and slogans repeat the same arc: crisis, delay, heroic entrance, victory. Anything that doesn't fit that structure is minimized, rushed, or removed until people forget it was ever there. At a British university, I met an American exchange student studying history. He was intelligent, curious, and confident. Over drinks, World War II came up, and he casually said America saved Europe. Not as a boast, more like reading a chapter title. I asked him about 1939 to 1941. He frowned and admitted they barely covered that period. Germany invaded Poland, France fell, Britain stood alone, but it was treated like a fast-moving prologue. The real story, he said, started when America entered. When I mentioned the Soviet Union losing around 27 million people, he laughed nervously and said the number sounded exaggerated. He knew battles, generals, and dates, yet somehow missed the largest human loss in military history. By the end of the conversation, he wasn't angry. He was unsettled. He kept saying, "They didn't teach us that." Not as an excuse, but as a realization. Like discovering an entire floor of a building he thought he already knew didn't exist. In a crowded, tense common room, an American backpacker leaned back and declared that without America, Europe would be speaking German. A Polish student quietly asked who invaded Poland first. The American shrugged and said, "Germany, but we fixed it later." That word, later, landed heavily. For the Polish student, later meant occupation, executions, destroyed cities, and family histories passed down in fragments. He didn't argue. He simply said some countries didn't get the luxury of waiting to be rescued. The American grew uncomfortable, not hostile. He said no one had ever explained it that way before. He had assumed Europe paused history until America arrived. No one had framed the early years as survival without guarantees. When Americans repeat this narrative, it's often meant as pride, not insult. But for Europeans, it sounds like erasure. It suggests that suffering before American involvement didn't count. That's why these conversations escalate so quickly. One side is repeating a heroic lesson. The other is defending memory. I was once in a shared kitchen when an American student announced that D-Day was an American operation. He said it proudly, pointing to a documentary on his phone. "This is where we saved Europe," he explained, like narrating a movie climax everyone had already agreed on. A Canadian student asked which beaches he meant. The American hesitated, then said, "The American ones." When pressed, he named Omaha and Utah. He looked genuinely surprised when someone mentioned Gold, Juneau and Sword, as if those beaches were deleted scenes. He insisted Eisenhower planned everything. A British student calmly replied that Montgomery shaped much of the ground strategy, British intelligence ran the deception campaigns, and Canadian forces took Juneau Beach. The American stared at his screen, scrolling faster, as if the facts might rearrange themselves. When he finally spoke, he said, "They didn't really explain it like that." Not angry. Not defensive. Just confused that the version he learned had quietly removed half the cast from the final act. D-Day works perfectly for simplified storytelling. One day, one landing, one dramatic turning point. It's cinematic, clean, and easy to teach. What gets lost is coordination, 5 beaches, multiple nations, years of preparation. Complexity fades, because complexity doesn't fit heroic structure. When education favors moments over processes, whoever looks most visible in that moment becomes the owner of victory. Planning, intelligence, logistics, and sacrifice blur into the background while the loudest image takes center stage. Later that same night, the same American mentioned Britain's bad tanks. He claimed Germany nearly invaded because British equipment was outdated. I explained that Britain invented tanks in 1916 and used them extensively. He nodded politely, unconvinced, like I was defending weak trivia. Then he searched it. Slowly. His expression shifted in stages. Confusion, disbelief, then mild embarrassment. "They never mentioned that," he said. He'd learnt American tank production in detail, but not that the entire concept began elsewhere decades earlier. What bothered him wasn't being wrong. It was realizing how selective his education had been. He wasn't angry at me. He was angry at the silence, at the missing context he'd never known to question. In Texas, a man once told me the Pacific War was America's real fight. Europe, he said, was secondary. I mentioned British, Australian, and Indian forces fighting Japan across Southeast Asia. He waved it away. "That's different," he said. "That's not the main war." I asked why 87,000 Commonwealth deaths didn't count. He shifted uncomfortably and said them mattered, just not in the same way. The Pacific, he insisted, was mostly American. History, it seems, has weight classes. That moment stayed with me. Entire campaigns can disappear if they don't fit a central storyline. If a war doesn't reinforce national identity, it quietly becomes optional reading. Wars aren't remembered by geography alone. They're remembered by relevance. In the US, the Pacific War is taught as a national trial. Southeast Asia becomes a footnote because it complicates the idea of a single heroic struggle. When history is filtered through identity, anything that challenges ownership risks being minimized. Not denied. Just gently set aside. In an American museum, I asked my girlfriend who captured Berlin. She hesitated, then said "we," uncertain but hopeful. When I explained that Soviet forces fought street by street through the city, she stopped walking. She didn't argue. She asked why she'd never learned that. I explained the scale, hundreds of thousands of Soviet casualties in one battle. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Flags raised over ruins while American troops were still miles away. Her reaction wasn't disbelief. It was shock at omission. "Why wouldn't they tell us that?" she asked. "Because admitting someone else finished the war doesn't fit a story where you're always the closer." At the National World War II Memorial in Washington, I searched for the Soviet contribution. After walking the site twice, I finally found it. A single plaque. Inside a side room. One sentence. Smaller than the sign pointing to the gift shop. An elderly veteran stood beside me, reading the same plaque. He told me he'd met Soviet soldiers in Germany in 1945. They shared cigarettes and stories. Those men had been fighting non-stop for 4 years, he said quietly. He shook his head and added that they lost hundreds of soldiers for every American casualty. Then he walked away. That moment carried more historical weight than any exhibit I saw that day. America didn't just win battles, it won the narrative. Museums, textbooks, and films reinforce a version of history that feels satisfying and nationally useful. Complexity is traded for clarity. Shared victory is replaced with brand recognition. This isn't accidental. Simple stories travel further. They sell better. And once repeated long enough, they feel unquestionable. At a Thanksgiving dinner in the US, an uncle leaned back after 2 beers and said, "If it wasn't for us, you'd all be speaking German." He wasn't aggressive. He was relaxed, confident, like stating a proven equation. I smiled and asked when Britain was invaded. December 1941, he said. I mentioned the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. I explained that Britain fought and survived before America entered the war. He nodded politely, then said, "Lend-Lease," like it was a trump card, a historical wild card that settled everything. I mentioned that Britain finished paying those loans in 2006. 61 years after the war ended. The table went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. Someone stared at their plate. No one argued. You can't debate facts you were never taught to expect. That silence matters. It shows the difference between disagreement and absence. Most people weren't rejecting history. They were meeting it for the first time. When education removes context, corrections feel shocking, not threatening. Surprise replaces argument because there's nothing prepared to defend. In a bar in Austin, a man told me Europe owed America everything. I mentioned India sending millions of soldiers, Canada storming beaches, Australia fighting on multiple fronts. He listened, then said they should make movies about that. I told him they already had. He just hadn't seen them. That landed harder than I expected. He looked down at his beer, slowly peeling the label. For the first time, the idea that history might exist without Hollywood approval seemed uncomfortable. Later, a teacher I met admitted World War II was difficult to teach honestly. Too many fronts. Too many countries. Too many deaths. Students wanted a clean story with a beginning, a hero, and an ending. Complexity lowered test scores. Simplicity kept parents satisfied. Textbooks favored clarity over completeness. America entered. America mobilized. America won. Everything else became supporting detail. Not erased on purpose, just trimmed until it stopped challenging the main storyline. Military victories end. Narratives don't. America's greatest success wasn't only industrial or military. It was communicative. The war was framed as an American story and exported worldwide through film, television, and education, until repetition hardened interpretation into memory. Years later in Berlin, someone tapped my shoulder near the Brandenburg Gate. It was an American I'd met before, once painfully confident. He still carried the same patriotic backpack, but his posture had changed. Less certainty, more curiosity. He told me he'd visited Normandy, Warsaw, and memorials across Eastern Europe. He'd walked through mass graves and museums his textbooks never mentioned. I was wrong, he said. Simply. Not defensively. Just honestly. He was training to become a history teacher. He laughed and said he planned to teach the messy version, the uncomfortable one, without a single hero. Good luck, I said. He smiled. Yeah, he replied. The textbooks haven't caught up yet. This isn't about blaming Americans for bad history. It's about understanding how national identity shapes memory. When stories become too simple, they stop educating and start promoting. Pride replaces accuracy. Comfort replaces truth. World War II wasn't won by one country. It was survived by dozens. British intelligence broke codes. Soviet soldiers broke the Wehrmacht. American factories built weapons. Canadian troops stormed beaches. Polish pilots defended skies. The French resistance sabotaged supply lines. 85 million people died. That number doesn't fit a heroic arc. It doesn't work in a movie trailer. So it gets softened, trimmed, and simplified, because shared sacrifice is harder to sell than solitary victory. Americans didn't win World War II alone, but they absolutely won the PR campaign afterward. And honestly, good for them. I just wish the rest of us had been invited to the victory party. Cheers.